Good afternoon, heathens, heretics, and anyone who got lost down the wrong rabbit hole of YouTube. Gods only know what would lead you here if you did not come here on purpose. Tonight I am re-recording a new introduction for an older but unfortunately still relevant video of a conversation that I had with the brilliant and knowledgeable Georgina Rose, also known as Darling, who I will link to her stuff on YouTube. She makes plenty of great educational videos and has very interesting conversations on her own podcast. I was thrilled to have this conversation with her. It was one of our first because we really got to get into this culture of constantly begging for permission, constantly being terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing in a craft that is inherently transgressive, that is inherently about being a fucking heretic. Heresy literally means to mediate the powers that be for yourself, to question dogma. No, that's not the defined term. You can go to the dictionary yourself. You know what I'm saying. I have been saying also for a long time that if you want some kind of, top-down, rules, structured, hierarchical kind of religion or practice, the craft is not for you. There is no pagan Vatican. Anyone who is claiming, to speak for all pagans speaks for none of us and speaks for probably something they are trying to sell you. So I will wrap up this introduction. I hope you enjoy this conversation. If not, remember that people are still allowed to disagree. So thank you for listening, and let's roll. Oh, it's been a couple weeks, I think, since I've recorded. All right, this is Outlaw Preaches, and I am not doing a solo rant today. For those of you who might be listening for the first time, my name is Lilith. I go by Outlaw Priestess online. That is not an initiatic degree title. I gave it to myself. It's a long story. Long story short, I'm a combination of a traditional witchcraft practitioner. I'm a card-carrying druid, literally. I need to post that picture later. And I suppose recovering dominatrix. I don't know what my sign is anymore. You guys can figure it out. If you're here, you kind of know who I am. And I am super thrilled to be talking to my badass guest today. So I will let you introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Georgina Rose. I go by Darling, DAAT, online. I'm a podcaster, YouTuber. I'm on a ton of platforms. I talk about Thelema because I'm a Thelemite. I'm a ceremonial magician. And I do a lot of sort of commentary on the community and about various sort of social topics that interact with the space, as well as educating people on Thelema.
I feel like that is specifically two of those things are how I noticed you. Is for one, you're extremely knowledgeable on what you make videos on and Thelema and just like what you post about. And your commentary just on the community and the subculture is definitely what caught my eye and what we're going to be discussing today, because I feel like you're both very knowledgeable and super practical, and you tend to focus on the craft itself, on the occult itself, and not so much on, I feel like you recognize some of the social stuff going on as well, but you tend to stay focused on like what is the actual beef of the matter, if that's a good way to put it.
It is, yeah, I really appreciate that, and thank you. But yeah, in terms of Thelema, I think a lot of Thelemic stuff is very hard to digest if you're just reading the material. So I wanted to bridge the gap. I felt like there was sort of a gap in people who are like women and younger in the Thelemic space, because the Thelemic space does veer a little older than some of the other communities. But yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on the state of the community, on the sort of things that are going on. I'm a very opinionated person, which I think people could figure out pretty fast, and I don't really hold my tongue very often.
Thank goodness.
But yeah, I think that the social overlap into our community is something that I try to talk about issues within the community rather than sort of the social issue thing. I think in general, our community has sort of been, there's been in the past couple years a big overlap with like activism and very specific social beliefs, which, while I think as esoterically minded people, there are certain things we're all going to kind of agree on. I think we need to remember that just because you agree on religion with someone doesn't mean you're going to agree with everything else, we have various positions and we don't always perfectly align. And I think that is causing a lot of tension in the community, especially as the age demographic is shifting right now.
Yeah, that's an important one. I feel like is the age commentary, or not the commentary, but just like that distinction, because people, when they come to the craft or they come to the occult or polytheism, and I understand that those are very different things, but when I think we talk about the subculture or community in a larger sense, they do tend to get mashed together. And people coming to it from, if you want to call it the Zoomer, the younger millennial generations, I mean, they have some expectations in their mind because and I guess we're just jumping right into it. For us, we have this precedent of the personal and political being so enmeshed together that people are sort of sitting there like, tell me what to do. Like, is this, and wanting permission for so much. Whereas like, I've joked about this before, but in like the 60s and 70s, dudes would literally read The White Goddess, call it a day, and start a coven. And that was just that. And I think you should do a little more research than that, especially because that book is not like it's, everyone has their EPG. Anyways, yeah, I feel like it's important to talk about some of the baggage that people come into the craft though. So I guess we can just get right into that. Oof, and I'm my brain is explaining two different things. Gosh, yeah, we've definitely like. Oof, I'm sorry. Do you mind if I start this over?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I'm just gonna note what time this was. Wow.
Sounds good.
Ugh.
Hey, it happens.
Thank you.
I've been recording a podcast for like a year and a half now. I know the feeling.
Yeah.
I get it.
I'm used to ranting by myself. All right, let's go. Alrighty. This is Outlaw Preaches, guys, and today I am adjusting to the fact that I am not ranting to myself by myself. For those of you listening for the first time, my name is Lilith. I go by Outlaw Priestess online, which is a self-appointed title. It is not initiatic. I was not granted that. And I have a few different things on my resume. I guess maybe I'll ask one of my friends at some point what I should lead with. I'm a druid, I practice traditional witchcraft, and I'm generally spicy on the internet with my opinions, I think, is what's happening. And today I am super thrilled to be speaking to my guest, who I will let introduce herself, and we will start from there.
Well, hello. I'm Georgina Rose. I go by Darling online, DAAT. I know a lot of people get that confused. It's meant to be this like tongue-in-cheek Kabbalah reference, but like no one gets it. So it is DAAT. I am a YouTuber, podcaster, blog. I'm on like every social media platform, and I make educational content and commentary. I'm a Thelemite. I'm a ceremonial magician, and I have a lot of opinions and thoughts. And so I thought I've been a big fan of this podcast. I've been really enjoying listening to it. And I think I, as someone who does run a commentary podcast myself, I thought it would make sense for me to come on, especially because I know Lilith and I are very much in line on a lot of the sort of social, occulture, subcultural topics that have become very relevant currently.
I definitely, I fangirl a little bit when you say that, because I'm definitely a huge fan of your stuff as well, which is why I was slightly flustered for this one. But it's awesome to talk to someone who has a combination of just knowledge and like a really practical focus. And obviously, I don't mind, and I don't think you mind talking about the subcultural and social issues around magic and around the craft and what have you. But I think it's important to separate out like what is the actual craft, what is actual practice, and what's the social baggage that people are kind of bringing into it, because those are not the same thing. And to muddy those, we've kind of been seeing what happens when people can't separate that.
Yeah, well, you need to be able to separate them. I mean, that's why like my YouTube channel is strictly educational most of the time, and my podcast is much more commentary. I don't really teach much on my podcast. I think that it's nice to keep those separate, because what makes the social thing a thing is because when it comes to the occult, a lot of us do seek community. A lot of people get into groups, they do group ritual work. And so because of that, you're going to meet other people. And as well as we are human beings coming into this, we have a lot of our own personal baggage. And a lot of people who come into the occult have various life situations that affect a lot. And there is some philosophical bents to various traditions. But I think in the end, we need to remember, like, there's a big difference between the social aspects of our community and like the, as I jokingly call it, like the culture war stuff, and how to actually do the rituals, how to actually understand the cosmology and metaphysics. I think we should, always keep those a little separate. I think we should be thinking about all of it, because I think everyone should be engaged in critically thinking and asking questions and thinking about these big topics in general, but they're not the same thing. And I think a lot of people can't separate the two. You know what I mean? And I think that can cause problems.
100%. And I feel like that's part of why that was like the original idea of this episode anyways, is because we definitely are in line on a few different things, but something that I feel like you've noticed and I've definitely bitched about quite a bit online is like we've lost that spirit of, as you put it, like of transgression. The point, at least with my background with traditional witchcraft, there's this idea of we're heretics, like it's literal heresy. And I don't mean that in an edgy way. It's like we're looking at sources like the Bible and we're looking at conventional religion and going, okay, here's how we're going to interpret that. We're going to cut out the middleman and go reach for gnosis ourselves and put this into our own hands. And that's what really makes me sad about, so much of the heavily charged climate that particularly young people are dealing with getting into the craft today, is like people don't have that two middle fingers up attitude. It's very like, can I read tarot? Can I do a spell? And it's like, no one has the right to tell you that you can or can't, like you're supposed to grab that. So we've gotten to the point where like people feel relatively comfortable and safe just like telling the church to go fuck itself when the church doesn't care anymore, frankly. I'm sorry, the Catholic Church is not pressed about occultists. I think they're witch anyway. It's shifted to this other sphere where I think, again, because of the age thing, a lot of Zoomers, a lot of younger millennials, we're very used to this. Everything is political. Every element of our personal lives has to be political. So we're seeing it through those lenses as opposed to the lens of like, what's the history of witchcraft? Like, what's our, if we're going to say community, what's our history with that? So I guess that's somewhere to start.
Oh yeah, as someone who is very, interested in the history of occultism, and specifically, I'm very invested in the history of the Thelemic movement. I talk about it a lot. The original Thelemites were very much heretics, right? We were considered pretty crazy. We were ostracized. With like Jack Parsons, I mean, we kind of got investigated by the government. We've had actually a pretty sordid history. We've had a lot of, people thinking Thelima's tied to various, very problematic things. We've had the government investigate us, like we got deported from fascist Italy, like we've had a lot of stuff happen to us. And through that whole time, Thelemites were very unapologetic with our beliefs. Like Jack Parsons, a Thelemite in the 1940s in America, he was working for the group that would become NASA, and he invented a lot of the jet fuels. So what he would do is he would go during the rocket test, and he would literally do the hymn to Pan in front of everyone there. They all thought he was super weird, but he just didn't give a shit. And I think like Thelema is a religion of people who didn't give a shit. We also have that very transgressive, heretical nature. We're very inspired by like Gnosticism and stuff. And so it's so bizarre to me that you can look at that history, you can read these people's writings, and then come out of that being like, yeah, I need to ask permission to, and I kid you not, blow out candles. There was actual discourse recently about whether or not you can like blow out your candles at the end of the rituals or you can snuff them. And like that level of asking for permission just doesn't track with our history. Tradcraft, Fleam, like all these traditions, and thankfully we don't have the same like social backlash we once did. Like I'm glad we're not, having these horrible things happen to us. But we have to remember like where we came from and where our roots are and sort of still embody that spirit. And it's just, it's such hard for me to like wrap my brain around the fact that we have this history, but we literally feel like we need to ask the internet Vatican for permission to blow out a candle. It blows my mind, and it feels very contradictory in a lot of ways.
100%. And like, I'm not bereft of sympathy for people who like don't know where to start because, you know, like I'm turning 25 this Halloween, you know, I'm not a fucking elder. I was on Tumblr in high school too, you know, like I'm familiar with the climate, and that's exactly why I'm so critical, is because I did grow up around a lot of that super fear-mongery, super like no breathing room, people don't get to fuck up, people don't get to learn kind of climate, and it's why I'm so against it at this point because, you know, whatever, I almost wonder if like the tradition itself is less important, because even if I look at not just traditional craft but like druidry, even this is, I suppose, like a reconstruction versus modern practice argument, is we sort of accept, even people with an interest in reconstruction, it's impossible to go back in time. We have only like so many sources. It's impossible to go back. So we have to do a certain amount of engaging with the true spirit of what we're doing itself. And that's where I kind of wonder, I'm like, you know, what is, when there's this heavy need for permission, need for external validation, what are you trying to actually achieve? And that's not shade, that I'm not being sarcastic. Like, I really want to ask these people, like, if you are so terrified, what's the MO of your practice or lack thereof? And that's where I kind of get into like, with a lot of people, it seems to be this very, it's like the spiritual expression of what people call being woke or being a social justice warrior, or what have you, because they don't want to be Christian because that's patriarchal and not cool. They don't want to be atheist because that's boring. So I feel like maybe they think witchcraft or paganism is safe because it's not, you know, whatever bogeyman that they're currently against. And that's fine. Like, I think we've talked about, Margot Adler has a classic great book on modern pagan history called Drawing Down the Moon, where she gets into like, you know, the history of like Z Budapest and Dianic Wicca. And there's always been people who got into, and like Starhawk, there's always people that got into witchcraft for political reasons. Um, and that's, you're right. But I think something that I did want to get into is just like, just because you get into it from that perspective, that doesn't give you the authority to start telling other people how or why they should be practicing, and setting rules from that place of like, okay, so you're heavily political, cool. That's fine, but that's not what witchcraft actually is. And that's where I jump in, because I'm like, when people start saying, oh, witchcraft is inherently political, okay, but for one, no, and for two, it's not your political affiliation. So I'll stop. I'll stop ranting right there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think like these ideas do have, to some extent, political implications. There are certain things like, you know, you're following a religion of transgression. That's going to imply like some anti-authority
Yeah.
stances. You know, like there are certain things that I do think sort of track. You know, I think environmentalism tracks. But the thing is, it's when, and this is something that Thelemites have done a lot. There's a bunch of people who argue Thelema is ex-political affiliation, because we do have a pretty, like, they're philosophic documents associated with Thelema. Crowley wrote about his own personal philosophies and stuff. And so a bunch of Thelemites over the years have tried to like say Thelema is X or Y affiliation. They all disagree with each other. They all pull different quotes and they all make arguments. And what I've realized is what it is there's certain political beliefs that I do think clash, but there's no one political ideology of the occult. And to say there is doesn't make sense and is ahistorical, right? Like if you are like running an oil company and destroying the earth, maybe you're not an earth-based pagan. That doesn't really make sense to me. But to say you need to be like, you know, a very specific type of political ideology, it doesn't track. That's where people lose me, because what I think it is it's this kind of like, especially with the Zoomers, because I'm in my early 20s. I'm technically like a Zoomer on the, like I'm Pluto in Sag, so I'm technically a Zoomer. And I notice with people on TikTok, because I'm on that platform, is that I don't think it's the seeking validation and the seeking permission stuff. I think it has less to do with the seeking the spirit's permission, because to be honest, if the spirit doesn't want to work with you, they just won't work with you. Like if you try to conjure some spirit that's not meant to you, they just won't show up. I mean, but what I think it is they're scared that other practitioners are going to attack them online, because so many of these people will say stuff on the app and then in private conversations say something very different, or they'll secretly have like an evil eye in their drawer. You know what I mean? They'll rail about how evil eyes are bad, which I don't think evil eyes are. I think you can have an evil eye. I think that's a false take. But they'll like do it in secret and just like make a different statement publicly. Like I think it's really like them trying to appease the peers rather than the spirit itself, which is very interesting. It's just like, and so many of these people have problems with it in private. They just won't say it publicly. You know, it's very church-like in a lot of ways. It really does parallel how like the church was back in the day, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to see people feeding into that. And something else that seems very obvious when you see all these people who are very focused on doing things in a socially proper way, and you're dignifying like what that idea of proper is by caving to it. It seems pretty obvious that like there is this alternate community that kind of exists just on the internet, because I've been, and this is not a snob thing, it's just like I jumped into the physical community when I was super young. Like as soon as I turned 18, I live in Los Angeles. It was easy for me to find, you know, like physical rituals and whatnot. So I started showing up to druidic rituals. I started just showing up and annoying people at like witchcraft gatherings, and now we're friends. But it's very different when you are interacting with people on a human level. You know their names, you know their dog, like, and it's not inherently well, the idea is you shouldn't be just trying to outdo each other, but you're not getting likes in person. Like it's a very different, there's less of a performative aspect. And sometimes there is, I'm not going to lie. Like sometimes people do want to look cool, and that's just human nature, but it's much less the intensity of that incentive to perform is kind of less present, and it's more about connecting as human beings. So when people don't have that and they've never experienced that, it's kind of not surprising to me that they are very focused on kind of, I feel like you've said internet hall monitors a few times. Like it's not surprising they go for that kind of acting like a prefect or something at a school.
Oh, totally. The offline community and the online community are very different. Like I've been to quite a few, events in person. I've met other Thelemites in person. I know these people. And the people who show up to real life events and online events, they're not the same crowd. Like I remember whenever I'd go to Thelemic events, and this is still pretty much true, I'm like half a decade younger than everyone else there. I'm always like the youngest person there, whereas online, I'm not that young, right? There are a lot of people who are a lot younger than me on the internet. Right. And so I think like there's literally just different communities. Like I think that, and I think the internet community is important to follow because the internet community will eventually become the real life community. Obviously, some people will leave and lose interest, but eventually the people who decide to take it seriously will probably end up, being involved with the events. And so I think we should consider what people are doing online, but they're very different spaces. Right. And in terms of the internet hall monitor thing, which is my sort of cheeky little nickname for them, yeah, it's very much a policing thing, because what they do is they see someone else's practice and it's not like socially correct enough, which is so funny to me because I've heard this expression before that you could be perfectly progressive and then 15 years later, if you don't change a single position, you'll be conservative, Totally. Which I think is a good way to evaluate like how our community views certain traditions. But they're so obsessed with like nitpicking other people's stuff. Like they'll see, like I saw someone who had a cedar bundle in a video, and a bunch of people were in the comments going, "That's white sage," and they're like, "It's literally not." But like this person got hounded. I know someone who made a video about budget witch tips, and they said if you don't want to pay for offerings, you can leave water. And one of the comments was, "What about the people in Flint, Michigan?" Like it's ridiculous how much these people police. And you can honestly, like, you can try as hard as you want to be as perfect as possible, and these people will find something. Like you will eventually misstep a little bit and they'll come after you. Like it's so authoritative. You can try as hard as you want, but the internet hall monitors, they're it's like they're always looking for someone to mess up. And if you're someone who genuinely doesn't know something, like let's say you don't know, you're new. Because when you're new, I mean, I cringe at some of the first stuff I did. I didn't know what I was doing. They'll sort of attack people who are just trying to learn, because realistically, we're all going to make mistakes. Whereas in the in-person community, maybe they'll raise an eyebrow, but you're not going to be attacked for saying something kind of stupid, you know?
No, because it comes with the territory. And I feel like when you are dealing with people in that more human way, everyone remembers skinning their knees. Everyone remembers being, younger, whether that's actual age or level of experience. And that's why I kind of, I hope it comes across, but I try to not be too overly mean about everyone who kind of engages in that sort of policing, because I think some of them do just want clout. They do want power. They do want to look like they're, the king of shit mountain or whatever. But some of them are well-intentioned and they legit just don't know. And, so they're going on the internet and trying to find practitioners, and this is the shit that they're getting hit with. So that makes me sad. So I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush. The people who are well-intentioned, hopefully they kind of develop thicker skin, or they find their way, and just kind of, put the middle fingers up to this stuff. But the people who kind of do want power, I really dislike it, because I think one of the things that does make sense is, like, on the internet, in the so-called internet community, we're sort of divided on what constitutes as authority. And I feel like you've talked about this on your account or on your podcast as well, where it's like, is that number of years practice? Like, what are we considering authoritative? And some people just take being as strict and dogmatic as possible as, this means I am an authority. And it's like, yeah, no, like, that doesn't apply to everyone necessarily. It's like a Christian saying, I'm going to hell. It's like, okay, I don't adhere to that, so it doesn't apply to me. And we don't cross that over into what we're doing, I feel like.
Well, yeah, I mean, what defines authority on the internet? It's much easier to become an authority on the internet versus in person, right? Because to be an authority in person, you have to be around communities for years and years and years. You have to work through initiations, or you have to open a shop, or you have to have books. I feel like those are kind of the traditional markers of authority. Whereas on the internet, I mean, like, you can just get a lot of followers really quickly. You can present yourself as authoritative. It's much easier to sort of gain that privilege and that status through the internet, which in some ways that can be good, because it can open doors to new people who wouldn't previously have had authority. Mm-hmm. It allows for new voices to come in quicker, but at the same time, that means it's really easy to sort of fake your way up, or take advantage of people who don't know any better and think you're an authority because of numbers. It creates a very different way of thinking, and there's a lot less sort of checks and balances, because on the internet, I mean, you piss some people off, they just block you on Twitter and you move on. Whereas in person, if you really mess up, you're probably going to get removed from groups and things like that. So it gets really messy really quick. And in terms of the people's intentions, I think a lot of them are good intention. To be honest, like, I think these people who are asking, can I blow out candles? Can I use an evil eye? Can I read tarot? Whatever. I think most of these people are genuine beginners who just want to be socially polite. They don't want to step on people's toes. They just want to do the right thing. And so for that, I mean, I have some sympathy for them, but there are people who, take it too far. They tell these people really crazy stuff to gain, clout, money, etc. And then these people come in with, like, really misinformed perspectives. And then you try to explain to them, like there was a big discourse about whether or not tarot is a closed practice to the Roma. This is historically incorrect. Tarot is from Italy, and modern tarot is from the Golden Dawn, which is in England. The idea that tarot belongs to the Roma is a stereotype of Roma people. It's honestly a really messed up idea. It's like you saw one of those, like, kids' spirit Halloween, like, Roma costumes, and we're like, this is the history of tarot, which there's a lot in there, but a lot of people genuinely believe this. And so I was trying to explain to people, I'm like, okay, this is why that's not true. Here are the sources. This is the actual history. I know it's not what you've been told, but this is the actual thing. And I would cite sources, make my point. And they would just turn around and be like, you're a bad person. You just are anti-Roma. And I'm like, well, can you give me a source in the other way? And they're like, well, asking for sources is, and then they go on this, like, spiral, right? Yeah. And it's these people who genuinely, like, they want to do the right thing. They have good intentions, but they get, basically taken advantage of by these people, which it's messed up. I mean, if someone just genuinely is confused because they've been told wrong information, like, I have no malice towards them. Right. That's something that happens. If you're, like, posting crazy misinformation online, then I have an actual problem with you.
Yeah, that's different. And I feel like that gets into some of the ancestral stuff where I do want to dig into that a little bit because, in traditional, and mind you, I understand this is not universal, this is just my background. In traditional witchcraft, there is an element of ancestral reverence. Like over Samhain, what we're doing is kind of, there's this idea of like helping lost souls cross over, and we see that as like an offering to, people earlier up in our line of like wanting to help them. And that isn't like culture specific. It's just like, okay, you have your progenitors of your literal bloodline, but then you have the people who came before you in your craft. You have people that came before you like in a community or skill that you've done. And that I think is pretty valuable and something cool for people to reflect on. But for one, it's not required. You don't have to do that if it doesn't call to you. And for two, that is not about ethnicity. That's about honoring those who came before. And we get into this really messy territory because, for one, like people, the same way we can't decide what constitutes authority, people can't decide like what rules we're applying to. And fucking spoiler alert, that's because there aren't supposed to be any. Like you're supposed to find your path for yourself. Like no, we're not supposed to all agree on that. But it's just odd because a lot of these people who are, I don't know what their name for themselves would be. I call them overly woke, but like these progressive people who are trying to be, I suppose the best intention is they're trying to be respectful. It comes back to just like woke ethno-nationalism, where it's like, unless you literally can trace your bloodline to X, Y, and Z, don't even think about doing this typically a generic practice that isn't a closely guarded secret. And I'm like, dude, how are you different from the fucking AFA at that point? Because, yeah.
Well, I think they're really not different from the AFA in a lot of ways, because what their argument is like you have to follow the tradition of your bloodline, which I mean, that's blood and soil is not too far from there. And in general, they're not just policing like actual practices that you could label as closed, like certain like Santeria in particular. You have to be initiated into that. I agree, that is closed. But I've seen people argue like Greek, you have to have Greek blood to follow Greek pagans. You have to have Nordic blood to follow Norse paganism. And that just, that's when it's no longer, I think that's just holism. I don't really see the difference. Yeah. Sure, you're framing it from a progressive lens rather than, the very reactionary one that the AFA takes. But it has the same end result. Yeah. Like, sure, the argument's a little different, but it's really the same thing. And so I oppose both with the same, I think that that's not a logical way to think about spirituality, because that would imply that the all-powerful gods are somehow weaker than genetic coding and bloodlines and national borders, which metaphysically doesn't make sense. Things like ATR, I actually get that, because a lot of the Loas, their ancestor spirits combined. So why that would have an ethnic component, that actually makes sense to me. I think that logically makes sense. But if you're saying like Odin is bound by people's DNA test, and Odin, who is all powerful, somehow cannot go over a DNA result, that makes Odin seem, one, extremely weak. It makes us seem way too high up in the divine hierarchy. And there's just a lot of sort of metaphysical issues. And it does basically result in a segregated community, and these people end up opposing things like syncretism. They oppose people learning traditions, like even if they're invited in and they go through the proper channels, like even if you properly convert, you're still not seen as legitimate when people have been, converted into other traditions for a very long time. Because as long as you're approaching something respectfully and you're listening to the actual people, you're fine. But these people don't listen to the actual people. They just put up these crazy walls, and it's just not a productive way to think about it. Most of the time, the people in the actual communities they claim to protect don't even really appreciate this. Like when people did the Roma Terra thing, a lot of the Roma community online were actually mad about it. Yeah. They were upset by this. They're like, this is actually setting us back because you're pushing stereotypes about the Roma people. And so it ended up just helping nobody except the people who wrote that blog post get clicks. Right. So it's completely counterintuitive and counterproductive. And on the ancestor work thing, I think you can work with the ancestors of your practice. You can work with the ancestors of your country, your literal direct bloodline, but you can also work with the people who have like guided you. Like, let's say you had an older mentor who passed away. you can totally work with them. Like, I know a lot of people who work with some historic occultists, you know, like there's a lot of ways to approach ancestor work. There's not only one, and you certainly can do ancestor work regardless of what race or ethnicity you are, because literally every religion tends to have some level of ancestor reverence. You see it in like Confucianism, you see it in Christianity, you see it in these folk traditions, like it's literally everywhere. So to say that you can't do this thing because of certain racial or ethnic backgrounds, like that's just absurd. Nobody invented the idea of ancestor work. That's something that's honestly ubiquitous in even our culture. We have a holiday called Memorial Day to honor the people who died fighting for the country. Like, that's honestly secular ancestor veneration. I think the idea that ancestor work can't be done if you're, you know, white or some other ethnicity is just kind of ridiculous.
It's what I appreciate, like, the looking at the actual moving pieces of what these claims are, because I feel like most of the people who spout these claims, they're not even thinking about it that deeply. And I almost wonder if they don't even know the root of what they're actually saying. Because, you know, if the claim is like, okay, white people can't, rather shouldn't, you can't make me not do it.
No, like, I'm gonna burst into your house. They're gonna come in. They're gonna like bring like a stang and be like, I saw you putting ancestor offerings out. You're under arrest.
I'm just like, dude, like, what, you're gonna SWAT team me? Like, I don't, like, fucking make me. But if you're saying that, like, white people shouldn't, and like, I have a fucking ancestor who fought in the Confederate Army, like, I get it, you know? Like, if the claim is white people have ancestors who did bad things, thus don't touch it with a 50-foot pole, it's like, okay, you're making this extremely overly literal. You're assuming that I'm deliberately working with specific people who did shitty things. And what, like, the claim is that white people appeared out of the ocean or dropped from the sky. Like, everyone has ancestors. And I feel like the point is not that our ancestors are perfect. It's like, what can we learn from their lives? Like, what can we glean from that? And just this obsession with, like, everything has to be pure and spotless and perfect, it's really counterproductive to being reflective, to being self-aware, and really just towards getting anything done. So, and also, totally other side note, I'm going to turn off my dryer because I'm hearing it squeak a lot.
So I can hear the dryer a little bit. And then I have a thought. I know the feeling. My AC unit is super loud in general.
Sorry, guys. That was the TikTok witches hexing me.
Yeah, they came for you. They knew what you said. You've sinned. But yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone is claiming that white people have never done a bad thing ever. Like, when I say white people can work with their ancestors, I'm not like, yeah, every historic thing every white person who's ever done is great. No, right. Obviously, like, people have done bad things. You know, there have been a lot of atrocities committed, but in general, people are pretty nuanced, and they're going to be bad people in your ancestry no matter who you are. I think, if anything, for white people, it's probably a good thing for them to work through ancestry, because then they can work through that baggage and, you know, really, you know, learn from that, right? I think that to say, like, ancestor work completely bad for white people, if anything, I mean, that's kind of erasing the past, because I think, you know, you should look at that so we know not to repeat the bad things people did. Right. I think that's why, like, history is taught so much, so we know not to make the mistakes of the people who came before us. I think we should work through that, and I think, you know, it can be helpful to really honestly look at that and think about it literally and go through that. But if you feel uncomfortable with it, nobody is forcing you to do it, right? Like, when I say white people can do ancestor work, I'm not saying every white person has to do ancestor work. That's ridiculous. First of all, I'm a rando on the internet. Okay. Yeah. Second of all, if you feel uncomfortable with it, that's fine. But I do think that sometimes we need to approach challenging things in spirituality. So, I mean, it's not, we're not the first people to do this.
Right. And I also, like, my thing with it too is really, like, okay, if you're saying, which I also disagree with what I'm about to say, but for the sake of clarity, you know, if you're saying pale complected people, white people, whatever the fuck that means, you know, should never engage in cultural exchange, they should not do stuff that isn't pertaining to their ancestry. But then when we do try and do ancestor work, when we do try and connect, I don't want to say our as in like I speak for all white people, but you know, when I focus on like Irish practices or Germanic stuff, like I feel like there's this catch-22 because it's if you focus on other traditions or you focus on other, what do you want to call it, like systems that aren't from your bloodline, then you're appropriating. But if you focus on your own, then you're a fucking racist white supremacist who's like only into your own shit. And it's like, can people win? Can
No,
like
it's
yeah.
damned if you do and damned if you don't, because in general, if you're looking for a more syncretic, eclectic path, I mean, you gotta, interact with other practices and other traditions and stuff like that can be challenging. There can be things that go wrong in that process. But if you stick to yourself, I mean, people can interpret that as like being kind of Volkish or something like that, which is, also a bad thing. It's really damned if you damned if you don't. I think in a lot of ways, I think in general, people have trouble swallowing the fact that every single tradition and practice has had bad things within it.
Yeah.
There is no like perfect, completely unproblematic system because as individuals, we're flawed, right? There's no lineage that doesn't have issues. Thelema has problems. I've admitted it. Like, does my tradition have some things we need to work on? Yeah, so does Wicca, so does Druid. Like, we all have, things that are problematic. There's always going to be problematic people in every tradition because I think humans are not perfect. I think if you're searching for a morally pure, completely perfect religion, you're never going to find it. You just won't. I mean, even atheists have done horrible things. So I think we need to just honestly look at the history of these things and accept that there are going to be problematic things you're going to have to work through. Like when you read these texts, are there going to be things that might make you uncomfortable? Yes. And that's why we should read it so we can, learn from that. There's no perfect system and there's no perfect individual.
Totally. And I find the idea of like avoidance of like almost avoiding the sinful, like avoiding the sin is just really strange because that's, at least for me, that's how you find out what you do and don't agree with. Though I do just want to say I'm trying to bring back the problematic stuff about Druidry because people always people used to bring up the cannibalism and the human sacrifice, and I'm like, yeah, bring it back. I would like to make Druidry violent again. But aside from that, and I could go off about that. That's a separate thing. I feel like the way that the Druids were human sacrificing people a lot of the time, it's the same way that we execute prisoners in prison, which I'm also against actually, but whatever, that's a separate thing. I feel like, just avoiding things being messy or avoiding things like even being like bad, like sometimes people do things that are shitty. That's why we're not venerating a specific person. It's about, to me, like when I think of the word witchcraft, that's a methodology, that's a skill set. You can combine that with certain traditions, obviously. There's certain specific ways to do it that will be tied to some beliefs or what have you. But it's a practice. So you're not under, I mean, even with the group that I'm most affiliated with, as a solitary, but Arnriach's Fane is the Druidic organization that I came up in. And they've 100% repudiated their founder, like to the point of saying his spirit is not welcome at our hearth because accusations about him and sexual assault came out like posthumously, which is also kind of wild because, he can't defend himself. But I was kind of impressed because I'm like, damn, okay, we don't even care if it's our founder, because it's not about him. It's about like, this is a body of work that people can use to come to their own terms, for themselves. So I think it's good when people make it about the practice and not specific people for that reason.
Well, we've had that issue in Thelema. So there's been a lot of discourse about where does Aleister Crowley fit in the Thelemic conversation. My stance has been consistent. I think we should view him as a human being and be critical, but we have to remember his work is really revolutionary and modern occultism would not look the same without it. So I say we read Crowley's work and we just, when we see something that we disagree with, we just disagree with it because you can read someone's work and not blindly agree with what they believe. Yeah. I don't think you should ever blindly agree with anything someone says. I think you should always be asking questions, critical thought. Like, please don't listen to what I say and blindly agree with everything I do. Like, that would not be good. I think we should never, take people as like gods. They're just not.
Yeah.
But a lot of Thelemites are like, because some of the things Crowley did don't hold up to modern standards, we should basically remove him. Like, they want to like write him out, stop using his name, stop discussing him, which I don't think you can even logistically do inside the, like, I don't really know the logistics of that. And I'm glad we're not like blindly listening to him, but to write him out is impossible. As well, I've seen this, and I did a whole campaign called Defend Occult Books, where people are saying you shouldn't read older occult books because they don't hold up. So they're like, they made literal blacklist. And I reacted to one on a Twitch stream once where they list a ton of authors, and they're mostly in Discord servers. Like, you literally cannot discuss the author, you'll get banned. Like, these authors are on a literal blacklist, and some of them are living. And so I've read through these lists, and most of these people I do not think should belong on a list like that at all. They're very people who are not that bad. Like, they'll say one off-color thing in their entire lives, and then they'll just get, removed from the history of occultism, which, that's a very different level than sexual assault. Like,
Right.
those two are not comparable. I think that we should view problematic people on the level of what they've done, because someone making an off-color comment in 1923 is not the same as, someone who's like really hurt people. That's a very different discussion. Right. But in general, I mean, I don't think we should be writing entire people out, unless I guess they're like super egregious, But I think we need to just not eliminate our history and seek a purity, because then what's left? Because let's say you only read modern books to avoid these influences. Who are they going to be citing? Like look at the bibliographies. Read one of the books from the bibliographies. Look at that bibliography. They all track back to these people you're trying to eliminate. Like, it's not possible. And I think that it's not the right way we should discuss challenging themes in our community.
Right. And this, some of this goes back to like, at least from where I'm sitting, like what we're doing is supposed to be like us getting our hands dirty, like us cutting out a middleman, like figuring shit out for ourselves. And being uncomfortable is part of the territory. And like, I think something we've both talked about is like, cultivating discipline, for example, like in our practices, when people get upset because that's harder, that's inaccessible, like, yeah, that's the fucking idea. It's not easy. That's what makes it valuable. And I'm not here to sit here and dictate, like, here's exactly how you should do that. Like, here's everyone should do the same thing. No. But the point, like, it goes against a lot of the ideas even of how magic works in the occult if your expectation is that everything should be not only sinless, but also easy to do. Because at least from how I was taught, I mean, magic is it comes from the friction of chaos and order, like, working together. Like, we are those annoying motherfuckers that get in between the heavens and the earth grinding and like make something happen. And that's why like certain, I don't know if methods is the right word, but like energy raising techniques like treading the mill or like creating cones and stuff, like it can be, physically uncomfortable for people once you really tune into that, because the point is that it's difficult. Otherwise it's, it's not that valuable. I'm sorry. Like, it's not.
What's the point of, so to grow as a person, you typically have to confront things or do something uncomfortable, right? Because otherwise you're going to stagnate and not change. I don't know why you would get into spirituality of any kind if you don't want to change, right? The point of these rituals are for them to make change, make an impact, make things conform to the will, all this stuff. And so if you're doing some ritual to, let's say, improve your mental health, like, you actually will have to do things after that. I think people just want to be handed the results. And when you explain like how to actually do the thing, it's no longer, I do this, I get thing. It's no longer, putting the quarter into the vending machine.
Yeah.
And they just kind of lose it. Like, when you explain, hey, if you really want this stuff to work, you have to learn certain techniques. Maybe try learning to visualize, to raise energy. It just becomes too much for people. And I really think like people need to remember that anything that will cause significant impact to your life tends to be hard. If you really want to like develop as a person, typically, that takes work. That's hard. Anything worth doing is going to challenge you. And
Right.
spirituality should challenge you. It should make you uncomfortable. That's the point. Otherwise, like, why are you doing it? Why are you making all these like little jar spells or whatever if you don't want them to actually do things? Because if you want to, like, say, bring money into your life, the way that could result is you getting more hours on your shift or something like that. Like,
Right.
if you want any real impact, I don't get why you wouldn't be willing to be uncomfortable and do discipline and work, because that's everything in life.
100%. And like this stuff, it's not even unique to to the occulture, to witchcraft practice or anything like that. Like this is literally just even people who do just meditation, for example, without any of the, other witchcrafty stuff, like that is going to start to have a change on you. Like you're going to break through in different ways with that if you just meditate regularly, if nothing else. And I kind of want to say, like, it's especially funny and odd to me that a lot of these people who are very nitpicky get real gatekeepery about, I guess, what we would call deity work, or like working with specific deities and having patrons. Because I'm not saying that's easier per se, but if your goal is, I simply want to make offerings and have X thing happen in my life without me being super uncomfortable, I'm not saying that working with a deity will achieve that, but it's definitely, it's not the same, it's different. And you can kind of, if that's what you want, like maybe stop shitting on those kind of relationships, because frankly, like some people do have relationships with their patrons that look a little more conventional in that way. I'm not saying it's easier, but they do exist.
Well, it's interesting. These people will be so militant about certain things. Like they'll be super intense, they'll have very strong opinions, but then you'll say something crazy, like something that I said that I got flack for, and I will die on the hill of. I will reiterate it. I do not care. Something when you start in ceremonial magic is the idea of a daily practice. Typically, this ritual called the LBRP, it takes a whole minute. I've timed myself doing it. It takes a minute and a half. So not long. I'm not asking you for much. Meditating for even 5 minutes a day. I'm not saying crazy stuff, though. If you want to go hard, I support that. But you'll say, hey, maybe try meditating for 5 minutes a day. And these people will get so mad at you. They'll be like, no, not okay. And I'm like, you spend more than 5 minutes a day watching witch talk videos. You
Yes.
spend more than 5 minutes a day devoted to your practice anyways. So why are you not, putting that work in? It's the people who are the most obsessed with nitpicking other people's practices who tend to have the least developed practice on their own. I think it's really like they put the energy on being the internet hall monitor and yelling at people on witch talk for, smoke cleansing wrong or something. And then in their personal life, I mean, they barely practice. Like I've seen this happen again and again and again. It's like they try to police the world, but forget to even, take care of themselves. Like the cobbler's kids have no shoes, basically.
Yes. I mean, I know that this is hard for like some people that want to do everything, but like it's my general thought that you have only so many hours in the day. You only have so much energy, like between work, between whatever you're doing. You do have to prioritize where your time goes. And if you are going to call yourself a witch or practitioner of whatever kind, it's not wild to me to think that like you should be prioritizing that practice. And slightly not apropos of nothing, but a slight non sequitur. Something else that we did want to get into that I want to remember to bring up, because I will forget things sometimes, is the idea of like working with the divine or sacred feminine or the divine masculine being something that people just routinely attack as some kind of bioessentialist tradcon idea, when that's simply like not what it is magically. And like it's not just that, but people using that as a just sort of a way to illustrate that they don't understand the difference between like mythic truth and like spiritual concepts or like magical concepts. They're not 100% literal in terms of a fundamentalist kind of perspective. So I did want to open that up a little bit because I was like, ooh.
Yeah, well, the thing, if you've read a lot of older occult material in particular, you're gonna notice, especially in like more mysticism-based traditions, they'll use like stories to explain like concepts. Like if you're learning the Sephirah, they'll tell stories and like little things about the Sephirah to make it make sense to you, because explaining the heady metaphysical concepts directly can be confusing, right? Even if you've read a modern Lon Milo Duquette book, he does this a lot. He'll like make little jokes, like little associations to make it click in your brain easier, because sometimes these really metaphysical concepts can be confusing. And so an easy way to explain that is to use material world linchpins to tie back to, right? Like if you can tie it back to something we know, it's easier for our brain to get it because it's how we work. So for a lot of people, comparing things to things that exist are, it's an easier way to explain it. I've done it in my videos, like when I was explaining like sort of the four worlds of the tree of life, like I used a lot of metaphors to make it make sense to people, because otherwise it's just very heady and it's much harder to swallow.
A little dry. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like a lot of the time when we talk about like masculine and feminine and stuff like this, I find it weird that if you've read all this stuff, you've read all these, broad abstract metaphysical books, you are unable to separate these things from literal biological essentialism.
Right.
Like if you're able to associate a bay leaf with luck, when like that's not a direct association looking at the bay leaf, right? You look at that, how does that directly connect? You understand that as a metaphysical connection. So I don't get why you need to like make the body feminine thing so literally. It feels very weird that you can do this abstract thinking that a white candle can replace any other color candle, but obviously it's all biologically essential, because those two don't make sense. Like if you think that you can do like substitutions, like a white candle for another color candle, because that's a common thing people believe, why are you then biologically essentializing to the hardest degree everything else? It just doesn't feel like that's logically consistent at all. And so I don't get why people look at the masculine feminine thing and immediately say it's only biologically essential. Sure, like there are some women who sort of do tie it like to their menstrual cycle, their womb, whatever, but that's not the only way the feminine is present in spirituality. Like the divine feminine has been discussed for a very long time. I know if you read Gardner's Witchcraft Today, he says like if the priestess is missing and there's some sort of emergency, you can sub out like people.
Yeah.
Like it's never been the most literal thing ever. So I find it so weird that these people who are so metaphysically informed like can't comprehend that maybe it's not this literal, and maybe we shouldn't try to eradicate this entire concept and maybe look at it in a more nuanced way.
Right. And I appreciate what you're saying about it just being logically inconsistent, because it's like you're not applying that same perspective, that same level of symbolic truth, of mythic truth that we all understand, like is not 100% literal and shouldn't be. I don't like it actually when people try and argue that their religion, whatever it is historically true. Like it's not even what makes it emotionally resonant for us. It's not even why we get into it, but whatever. But I get so caught up with this. Someone that I've learned a lot about traditional craft drum in person is like a 60-something-year-old, sexy, gay British guy. And I have a ton of respect for him because I feel like he was actually transgressive, and like he actually called himself a witch in public when that meant a little more than it does now. And he talks about how like he doesn't this is just what I've gathered to paraphrase, like he doesn't appreciate people trying to 100% eradicate all mentions of specific gender, of masculine or feminine energy, when we're not even claiming that those are hard and fast in themselves, because he can pull what we consider high priestess energy, or a woman can pull, quote, masculine energy if she's the best one for the job. It's not about like your what's the term, biology is destiny. It's not that. It's like he specifically said things like, and I get that the language might be clunky because he's older and like we don't use the same words anymore, but he specifically said things like, witches are spiritually hermaphroditic, in that we need to be able to pull, if we're going to recognize certain energies, we need to be able to pull from all of them. And I get that not everyone is going to see that the same way, or they might phrase it differently or what have you, but just because someone is recognizing certain polarities or certain energies, you do not have to work with it in that specific way. It's just saying, okay, these are here, these are the connections we're making, it's not always the same.
Oh yeah, well in Thelema, it's pretty much like we see like there's masculine and feminine energy in everyone. Crowley himself recommended that people work with like a deity of the opposite gender of them to help them discover their own balance and become not super far on one direction because he thought balance was quite important. I don't see why we need to make it so literal. And if you are someone who is uncomfortable with it for whatever reason, I don't see why you can just not involve it in your practice and just let other people use it. Because there's a bunch of groups. There's not only one coven. There's not only one group. You can make your own group where you don't use it, and there can be a group where people use it. I have a problem when people who are uncomfortable with it, like I was talking about the divine feminine on Twitter at one point because it's something that I resonate with. And I had a bunch of, they were all men, interestingly enough, in the replies who were like, hey, this is stop, they were kind of annoyed with me using it. And I was like, well, if you don't want to use the term masculine, feminine, just don't use it for you and let me use it. It's not that deep. We can disagree on these things. I'm not busting into your house and being like, I haven't heard you say the word divine feminine enough. There's no reason why we can just have different practices, because we do have different practices. Every single person has different beliefs within the occult. We all practice differently. So I don't get why, like, we can let some people, if they really want to connect to the divine feminine or whatever, do that, and other people just keep it out of their practice.
Right.
There's no reason we all need to agree. I don't think we ever have all agreed.
Yeah, no, that's there's a saying like 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and that's like equally or doubly true with witches and occultists. And that's kind of the point, I think. And it's just interesting because like for people that are otherwise capable of symbolic thinking, I feel like we dignify the royal we. I'm not actually part of this, but when we when we knee jerk like that, we're dignifying what we oppose. Because if you are conceding that all mentions of gender, all masculine or feminine is that tradcon type definition, you are putting them at the top. Like you are acknowledging that their framing is the definitive and correct one, whereas I don't cede that ground. Like it means to me what it means to me. And something that I kind of would appreciate more reflection on is like when we spend so much time reacting against and knee-jerking something, we make that the important piece where there's so many other things we could be focusing on.
Well, I think in general, when we cede a big concept to another group, we lose our control over it. Like, there's been a big pushback against Wiccans recently, which I find kind of absurd because I've actually met Wiccans, and this idea about Wiccans is just not true. But basically, the idea is that, like, all Wiccans are, in the words of them, problematic. So we should all quit Wicca. Okay, let's say you do that. Mm-hmm. So what's going to be left for the people who get into Wicca?
Right.
Or if you all leave a certain practice, you all leave Thelema because some Thelemites are bad, all that's going to be left are the people you oppose, and that's going to take over the entire tradition. When you move away from something because of a bad element and tell these people to avoid it, it will strengthen it on their side, and those people will develop an idea that they're under attack, which in general, when people become defensive and they're on the defense, they tend to double down a lot harder. And so it creates these echo chambers, and these people double down really hard. And so it actually ends up pushing that tradition way further down what people are claiming they are.
Right.
Because in general, people, when they're on the defense, they behave differently. So I think we should think about that when we have these conversations. And you are right, it does dignify the tradcon perspective. It honestly dignifies bioessentialism. If you claim that divine feminine, divine masculine cannot be separated from bioessentialism, you're completely ceding those concepts, which historically isn't true, metaphysically isn't true, and just ends up, it loses ground, and it creates a more separated, polarized community.
100%. And this is sort of where I would like to try and encourage more like people across paths and across practices talking to each other, and especially across like political divides or social divides as well, or divides, because if you don't even like say the metaphor is like we're all neighbors in a community or whatever, if we're practicing sort of parallel to someone on the internet and we have no fucking idea what they actually think because we're caricaturing what we perceive their views to be, for one, we might be making them worse than they are. For two, even if we end up disagreeing with them, I'd rather know what it is they actually think and disagree with them accurately. And that's why I talk to a ton of people I have huge disagreements with, like fundamentally as a person. Um, but the question is, like, can you be civil to me for the duration of our interaction? And are you like actively harming anyone in a direct way? That's kind of what I'm going to look at. And I just really dislike the idea that people can't even speak to anyone else or look into certain ideas without being held personally responsible as like, oh, I'm vouching for, like, I've studied Satanism. I think it's kind of reactionary and dumb. No offense. Like, do whatever the hell you want. It's not for me. So to like, if I get on a huge kick of like researching it again, that doesn't mean I'm the Satanist person or I'm vouching for it, you know? And like,
Oh
again,
yeah.
no offense to Satanists, fucking Pat, like, aka Biker Witch, like my brother and whatnot. He's one of the biggest theistic Luciferians in the world. We give each other shit. Like, it's not hate.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we should be communicating with people we disagree with. I make a very strong effort to not just talk to Thelemites. Interestingly enough, a lot of the people I'm closest with who are occultists are actually not Thelemites. I like to talk to other people, and I find that I've made insights about Thelema from talking to other people and reading other material, because a lot of these traditions have influenced each other. And I think in general, we should actually listen to people. I think on both sides, there is, after a certain point where people kind of are unreachable, or there's like a threshold we should kind of not cross, you know, but in general, I think we should listen to other people's opinions to a pretty good point. I think I think people can go way too far one direction where I don't really want to interact with them at that point.
Sure.
But in general, I think we should communicate with people we disagree with, because that can expand our minds, expand our perspectives, and it tends to make more sense when you actually hear the people's arguments rather than how their arguments are being placed by the people who oppose them, who have a pretty biased reason to portray them poorly. You tend to get a different impression, because most people, do think out what they believe. And so I think we should, always be open to discourse and always have critical thought about what we believe.
Totally. And like, I also understand not everyone is going to have necessarily the patience or even personal interest to like get into it in detail with people they have huge disagreements with. Like, I'm not even saying everyone should do that or to excess. People will find their own way with what works for them. But I feel like it's sort of what a lot of this comes down to is like, okay, if you don't have the patience or interest in doing something in a certain way, do not apply the least charitable interpretation to other people who do have the patience or interest in doing it. That's kind of where I come from.
Yeah, I just think that we should all sort of accept that we're not going to agree with everyone in the community and be okay with that. Because no matter, it's honestly a life thing. In general, you need to be okay with the fact that not every person under the sun is going to agree with you or like you. I think that's something that people struggle with, especially in today's culture where a lot of people are sort of coddled to a certain extent. They have trouble recognizing that there are going to be people who disagree with them, who don't like them. And I think that we have to realize that occultists are people, witches are people, and so we're all going to have things we disagree with. And I think it's a good life skill to learn to communicate with people who we may not perfectly align with on everything.
Totally. And I feel like I tend to be a little more on the blunt side with ideas that don't really jive with me or don't resonate with me, because just because I don't dig a certain concept, it doesn't mean I fucking hate anyone for whom, it does connect with them. Like, that's completely a different thing. And that sort of, it goes back to like, I really dislike the pressure implied of the idea that the personal is political. It's not just the idea. It's like there's this inherent pressure that comes with that where people feel they have to justify every single fucking choice they make, from blowing out a candle or snuffing it to like, oh, I'm into this path versus another. And it's like, you need to give people breathing room. And, I would rather know where someone actually comes from. So applying that onto them, kind of like without their consent, is just not something that's even effective for knowing what they're even saying or what their message is.
Yeah, the personal as political is an expression I have a lot of problems with, because there's another expression that I really like called critique ideas, not people.
Right.
I think in general, there are, of course, certain actions and certain beliefs do have political implications and connections. Yeah. That's true. I will agree with you there. But to act like every single choice a person makes 24/7 is going to like make some crazy political change is just not true. Being realistic, an individual really can't do that much, and certainly blowing out a candle does not do shit. Like, well, whether you blow out or snuff a candle will affect 0 people's lives, okay? Yeah. So I think when we say personal is political, we put way too much pressure on people because that's not even an honest assessment of how politics work.
Right.
Because to make political change, you actually have to work pretty hard. Like, even, like, have you noticed how many protests there have been over the years that have done nothing? Like, people do full-on protest campaigns with hundreds of thousands of people that don't result in any change at all. Right? It takes a lot to make real fundamental change. So I think when we push this on to individuals, and not individuals in the way that they do political advocacy, because obviously if you're like going out and marching, that's political. Yes, we can agree there. But I mean, to push it on like people's little personal things they do, I just think that that asserts too much control over people, and it's not honest with how politics work. And I think it honestly just functions to polarize people and make people feel like they're walking on eggshells all the time. And look, no one likes it when someone's walking on eggshells around them, trying to be too nice because they're worried about offending them. Like that's always results in very awkward conversations. I think it's not productive, and it's not honest with how politics work.
Totally. And I appreciate that facet of it as well, where it's like it's giving a ton of credit to really just not significant little actions. And it almost reminds me of like this obsession with everything is manifestation. Every single word you say is like you're fucking changing your whole life. And it's like you're there. It's kind of not surprising to me that these people are usually super narcissistic. I'm sorry, but I think they are, because it's usually the same people that are like, I'm so hot, I'm so sexy, I'm a goddess. And it's like, you're insufferable is what you actually fucking are. Sorry. Just to say that. And I get like people trying to build confidence by like saying things until they believe it. I understand affirmations, but there's just this very like you're attaching a ton of importance to things that are not creating that much change. And I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Good. With the narcissism I'm so hot thing, my big issue with that is I don't actually think that works well. There's a concept called I think we all know what body positivity is, but there's another concept called body acceptance, where it's essentially accepting how your body is, how it is. It's what I live in, it's what I walk in, it's what I exist in. Sure, it's not completely perfect. I don't think it's completely perfect, but I'm okay with it. I think that's actually a way better strategy for learning to love yourself than this very intense, hard line, I'm so hot thing. Because when you're constantly telling yourself you're so hot and then you spot an insecurity, it's going to really make you feel like your entire image is a lie. Whereas if you can be honest, like, my body's what feeds me, what's moved me around. I think I'm attractive in some ways, but I do have some flaws, but that's okay because my body is meant to live, I think that's actually a much healthier way and is going to lead to less insecurity. Because I think, it's been proven, right? The most narcissistic people tend to be the most insecure. So if you're constantly telling yourself how perfect you are, I think that can cause a lot of sort of distortions and actually cause more insecurity in the long run. It's not really occult related, but it's something I've believed for a long time.
Yeah, and it's kind of sets yourself up to fail because, kind of like what you're saying, if that is your standard, if that is what you're trying to make true, like I almost have it's not exactly the same, but I've had a different version of this. Part of why I don't do a ton of clips. I delete TikTok every 2 weeks is like and this is a tangent, but like I was what I would call like performatively hot or like professionally hot or whatever. That's not me saying, oh, I'm so hot. It's like I had
But you were a dominatrix. You kind of have to be hot.
Exactly.
That's
like,
part of the fantasy, I feel like.
Yeah, and I just straight up burn myself out because it sets you up for this weird situation of like, what about days where I'm tired or sick and I just want to wear a fucking bathrobe at home and chill? And then it's like, oh, am I a fraud? Am I fake? And it's like, no, bitch, you're a person, like you're allowed to have different days and seasons. So I've been like almost recovering from that and just like finding some equilibrium again. And, maybe I don't need to wear huge fake eyelashes every fucking video I make. Maybe it's okay to just be a person. But that's kind of where I want people to just reflect more in general of like, not every single little thing you do is stepping on someone else's toes, and also it sets you on high alert, you know, and puts you on this weird, like, I don't want to say traumatized because I dislike that word being thrown around too much, but you burn yourself out being so concerned about everyone else's reaction. And like, you know, manifestation is a real thing, and you probably shouldn't talk shit about yourself. Like, the way you talk about yourself is important, but it's not a substitute for anything else. And that's kind of just what I don't like, is we conflate all these different things that are legit in their own right. I'm not shitting on, you know, people ever doing it, but if we can't understand the distinctions, I don't think we're going to get anything done. And that's why, frankly, like, I'm just going to make the assumption that a lot of these people who are overly on TikTok or overly whatever, I highly doubt much of what they're doing is amounting to anything in their lives, you know, apart from obsession and apart from fixating on stuff. But you know, I kind of, before I go on too much of a tangent, or I don't want to take up too much of your time, something that you put a finger on that I thought was really apt was just like, you're definitely more on TikTok than I am, so I feel like you can observe things a little more continuously. You were saying you feel like there's almost a new paradigm or a new current, as it were, of craft that they're creating for themselves, which is an interesting way to look at it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think they're their own unique tradition. I strongly believe this because, look, they have very specific beliefs that don't align with the rest of the community, but they all agree on. There's certain practices that they partake in. They do the jar spells. They do, there's a specific way that they tend to dress their candles. There's certain crystals they use that the rest of the community doesn't talk about much. I'm talking like citrine, moldavite, you know. There are certain types of incense you see them using more. You see a very specific, like, you can look at their setups and you know that's a TikToker's setup. Like, there are very specific things. They have different views on like deity signs, like certain things like that that you don't hear discussed as much in the way that they discuss it. They have this very strong focus on ethnicity and like ethnocentrism. And there's very specific things that they do. And as well, they're very solitary. And so it's like, you know, it's kind of like an eclectic ethnocentric practice, but it's distinct. I don't think that they're following a previous tradition. Sure,
Right.
yeah, you can argue it's sort of a breakup of eclectic witchcraft, but I think it's its own distinct flavor. Like, I fully believe like it could give its own ism at this point because they even have philosophic beliefs.
Yeah.
Right? They have a very specific philosophic, they have this political lens. Like, all these things, they come together and they're essentially a full-blown paradigm. Literally, like, they have religious beliefs about how gods work. They have their own techniques, their own rituals, their own philosophy, their own views on culture. Like, I don't see why it's not its own tradition. Like, TikTok witchcraft, we already basically use it as a title. We may as well call them like the TikTokist or something. Someone come up with a better name than I can come up with. But I feel like they genuinely are their own thing. I think that they're not the same. And I know Thorn Mooney has expressed conversations about this, that she doesn't feel like as a Gardnerian Wicca, she's really doing the same thing as solitary Wiccans, but that's okay. Like, I think that these TikTok witches, they're doing their own thing. And I don't think it's the same as what we're doing as people who practice older, more established traditions. I think they're creating their own tradition currently. And I will see if it stands the test of time. But people who run occult shops who I've talked to say that that certain products are selling more. Like, I think they're genuinely their own current, sort of how like chaos magic became its own current, or how eclectic Wicca did the same thing. I think they're doing just another wave, and I think that they're eventually, I mean, some of them are starting like little covens with each other, though they're not like traditional style covens. It's like I get together with my friends and we do rituals together. I mean, they're starting groups. I think it's genuinely its own tradition, and I fully give it. I guess people are like, you're giving them too much credit, and I'm like, well, I think that they deserve that credit. I think they are their own thing. I think that's not giving them too much credit. I think it's an honest assessment of what's going on.
Totally. And I think that that's really, I appreciate the practical approach of that, because, you know, in what, maybe like a year or something ago, when I started to be aware at how much of a thing it was, my first knee-jerk reaction was, fuck these kids, like, this is fake, this is bullshit. But that doesn't mean it stops existing. Like, they are influencing trends to the point of they almost dictate what we talk about on fucking Twitter more than any of the actual people on Twitter do, because we're so busy being like, oh damn, these kids are at it again. And that's part of why, like, my initial commentary was hey, maybe if we're gonna call them kids and we're gonna put ourselves with the grown-ups, maybe actually be an adult and set some conversations for once. Don't just react to everything. But just because, and I've caught myself saying this about a very different kind of person, like maybe the more folkish type people, that just because we don't like them, it doesn't mean they don't exist. We have to deal with that in some way. I don't fucking like them either. But it is the same thing with the people on TikTok, or whatever we're going to call them. So I mean, if they're influencing what sells at occult shops, that's not bullshit. And I think it's interesting because I have been thinking for a while, and I've tried to speak to a few elders on this, of like, I feel like the the cultural history of like witchcraft, at least in America, or the maybe the UK to some degree, used to be very much, there was this coven structure. You would come up in a certain way. You had to earn your stripes, as it were, under high priest, high priestess. And that's kind of fallen apart. Like that's sort of fallen out of favor. We would probably call that gatekeeping if that was more of a thing now, which I think we could fucking use some, sorry. But for better or worse, like that coven structure of working your way up that way, it doesn't happen anymore. So for the most part. So I'm kind of like, all right, what's going to be our answer to that? Do we have one? Is it just something we don't care about? Like, is there no we? So it's kind of interesting that way.
I call it decentralization. That's how I personally call it, because the reality is I think what really sparked it off was the internet. Because the second the internet came to be, we lost control. Yeah. There is no way to properly do a gatekeeped order anymore. Like for Thelema, as well, you can have a lot of mixed thoughts about this, but all the stuff got leaked. Mm-hmm. You can learn pretty much everything on your own now. Of course, there are certain things you can't, but in general, that older structure is in a lot of ways sort of outdated. It has value, but if you see and I've talked to people who run groups, people who come in at like the 0th degree perspective tend to know a lot more than people 20 years ago. Yeah. And so because of that, it's hard to shape them as a new student because they have all these ideas in their head. And so I think we shouldn't fight it. I think at this point, it's way too late. We are like 40 years too late for that, 30 years. There's no way to turn back the clock. I do think that there are certain things that I really disagree with. Do I like what the TikTokists are doing? No, I don't. But we can't turn back time. We can only stop what's happening now. And we can only impact what's going to happen in the future. There's no real way to return to how things were. Of course, there are groups like that still exist, but it's never going to be how it was in the 90s or 80s again. And I think we need to acknowledge that and figure out how to gatekeep and how to teach people in the modern way. Yes. Like we need to be able, if we want to make the impact that we once did, and we want to stop these sort of dangerous trends and make people, occultists in the way that we want them to be for whatever reason, you have to adapt to what people are doing now, and you have to find a way to reach the people now. Totally. Because right now, I mean, we're not reaching some of them. And I think if we want to teach people in a more conventional way, I think we just need to adapt. It's happening with religions that even aren't occult related. Like this is kind of happening across the board. It's really what the internet did to the world. I mean, we've been digitized and pretty much everything's been decentralized. The gatekeeper is kind of dead in a lot of ways. And so I think gatekeeping, this is the thing. I don't think gatekeeping is all bad. I think gatekeeping is bad if taken too far, but to a certain extent, gatekeeping is kind of needed. I think we all actually agree with this. We just agree with it at different extremes, right? Like, I think we can all agree, let's not give flying ointments to kids, and maybe you shouldn't claim to be practicing some crazy initiatory practice if you've never met someone from that practice. Things like that, I think we all actually agree on. And so I think we all fundamentally agree gatekeeping is important. It's just how far it goes is kind of in question.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a noted and important difference between fucking like bullying people for being new and going, hey, there's actually a pacing, there's like a linear progression that goes with certain traditions. You can't just obliterate that and claim to be practicing it, then you're doing something else. And that's more where I fall in it, of like, hey, there's a reason that you would work your way up with certain things. And it's not because you suck or you're inferior or you're not good enough. It's like, something just might not even click for you until you've done certain things. Like there's a reason meditation's important, doing regular cleansing, like whatever. Like there are building blocks, and some things they just won't click for you. So it's not like you're not good enough or whatever. It's just, it's linear progressions. So yeah, I would strongly agree with that.
Yeah.
But there was also people who would kind of abuse the power or authority that they had as like, and just sort of use their titles to I'm trying to stop swearing, but essentially to just shit on other people of like, oh, well, I'm a third degree initiate, so you don't know anything. And I think there's some positives to decentralizing, as it were, because then you can't just rest on your laurels that way. You have to, I don't know, but it does make things a lot more challenging for sure.
Yeah. In general, this is maybe a hot take. I somewhat support decentralization. I think in a lot of ways it was a good thing. I mean, it has problems. This is the thing. I think there's no, I wouldn't really trust them if they had a 100% positive or a 100% negative opinion on the decentralization, because it opened the floodgates. In Thelema, like, we have a problem of people like much like how people chased validation on TikTok, I feel like this is like the mirror of it. They use their titles and their degree to validate their practice rather than the practice itself. They rely on their community status. They rely on, I'm a member of this order. I have this specific degree title, which is why I actually don't use degree titles ever when I talk about Thelema. Like, I think that's basically the equivalent of the TikTok clout chasers who think having 100,000 followers makes them valuable.
Totally.
People do that with degree titles. They do that with reputation. They do that with status, with other status symbols. In general, those degree titles, what they do is they represent progress, but they shouldn't be used as a status symbol. But let's be honest, people use them as that. A lot of people do.
100%.
Like Thelema, it happens a lot. We have a problem with it. So it's nuanced, and a lot of the problems we're seeing within TikTok not originate from TikTok. They're just showing in a very new way. It's like how the Volkism is coming back, but through progressivism, It's sort of like all these old problems have been amplified and inverted.
Totally. And I feel like that's something that we should learn from, because it's sort of like we were talking about earlier, like you can't just I don't know if memory hole is the right word, but you can't just completely remove someone who's made a lot of contributions to occult history or certain practices, because those ideas are still going to be there, even if you take their name out of it. And this is the same thing of, even if we don't want to acknowledge the importance of certain parts of history, we're going to keep playing it out, because human nature doesn't change all that much. Like, we're still just people, and we're prone to do certain things. So I think it is, I appreciate the balance of like, yeah, there are pros and cons to what's happening right now. And I know even like from the people that I've met in real life, like there are people who kind of still flaunt their third degree initiations or whatever, who haven't really practiced in like 15 years. And I'm like, dude, good for you, like in 1983 or whatever, but you're not doing shit right now. So maybe stop knocking the people who are at least trying, or at least doing something. So yeah, I know I can rant a fair amount, so I don't want to take up your whole day with it. But I really appreciate you kind of like just opening up a lot of these ideas and like just injecting some balance, nuance, and like just different ways for people to be reflective, because for all the various reasons we've discussed and more, like that seems to be in short supply lately. So I think you're doing really good work, and hopefully this is good food for thought. You're very welcome.
I always find your podcast, it feels balanced. It feels like you really think about things in a more nuanced way. Because I find that typically the truth is somewhere in the middle, or there's truth in each perspective that needs to be balanced and mixed to get the like true reality. Because typically people are observing things. They're just observing it through different lenses. And so I think through critical thought, we can see the actual, answer of the situation.
I definitely appreciate that. And I'm like, the past week, I've been trying to think of like a bumper sticker version of the idea of like, I want people to engage in more critical thought than critical theory. They're not the same fucking thing. So it would be nice to just acknowledge that. But
critical theory is that's a whole long conversation.
I should have brought that up. I almost feel like it's just funny because I don't want to say self-censorship, but there's almost this idea of like, if you are questioning any of this, that it's spicy or that it's a hot take or whatever. And I'm like, I don't think we said anything that's all that nuts, but I'm also up in it. So I'm not a good gauge for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, consistently, I think that I'm not saying anything crazy, and then I get like labeled as controversial or a dissident or something, and I'm like, you're kidding me, right? You're kidding. Really?
Well, hopefully keep taking it as a badge of honor. It means you're doing something right. Where can people find your crazy heretical videos and whatnot?
Yeah, so I'm under .darling DAT on. I gotta go through all of them. Sorry. I have to like rack my brain. I'm on so many platforms. I'm on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, Patreon, and I host Magnolias and Magic on all major podcasting platforms, as well as YouTube. So I'm pretty much everywhere. I'm on like every platform but Facebook, pretty much.
That is true, including the TikTok, which I will do my monthly re-downloading and then deleting very soon, I'm sure. So I strongly recommend, if you guys have not checked out Georgina's stuff yet, I strongly recommend it. And
you.
you are very welcome. It's well deserved. Hopefully, if you guys are here, you kind of already know where to find me. But I am Outlaw Priestess pretty much everywhere. If you're seeing my pictures and it's not attached to that name, you are being catfished. It has happened before. But I am on Patreon and Twitter and Instagram for the most part. I technically have accounts elsewhere, but I only have so much give a damn. I only have so much energy. So anyways, thank you very much for this conversation. Hopefully it will be food for thought for some people, and a happy equinox. I'm not sure if you...
Equinox.
Oh, how do I feel like I end this the same way? And it is, thank you for listening, but get off your computers, get off your screens, go outside and do some actual fucking magic. Hopefully that's what you get.
All right, thank you for tuning into that conversation. As I'm sure we just said in the original recording, you can find more of Georgina on the internet, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, of course, right here in this website under .darling, and she has her own Patreon as well, where you can find more awesome exclusive content from her. You can also support my heresy and my shenanigans on my own Patreon, which is just called Outlaw Priestess. Not Occulture Wars. Bad branding, I know, but I am attached to that name. So if you would like to see more heresy, then you can support either or both of us. Thank you for listening, and now is time to close the screen, close your phone. I can't even remember words. Go outside and go do some magic.